You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Red Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
Kia Wilson of Streetsblog USA. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Kia. How are you doing?
A little caught off guard. I didn't know I was saying my own name, but I'm very happy to be here with you.
Yeah, well, great to see your face. Great to be here with you. How are things going in your universe?
You know, I'm tired. But, in my personal universe, my life here in St. Louis and my community, it's awesome. Covering national transportation policy is a different story, but, you know, we'll see how it all turns out. We're on a roller coaster ride together as a country.
Yeah, well, so before we get to that news, I want to actually ask you first about like the biggest news in the space, which it's crazy that that isn't necessarily the biggest news of what's happening in DC, but unfortunately, the legendary Donald Shoup passed away recently. Do you have any feelings or thoughts about the Shoup dog?
I have so many feelings and thoughts. I'm very sad, for one, and also very grateful to someone who I think the outpouring of remembrances of him are a testament to just how much that guy was loved and how much his work was loved. I got to interview Donald Shoup a few times during my career. The biggest one, the long form interview that I did, went up on Streetsblog, I think in 2022. I'm happy to send you a link to that. And I don't know, I think what I wrote on Blue Sky about him was like, he was just one of the kindest people I've ever interviewed, and also one of the most creative. Like, I think we kind of forget that this guy who wrote a 750-page doorstop of a book about transportation, like, it wasn't a doorstop because it was a textbook that was like painstakingly thorough, though it was painstakingly thorough. It's because he really did this incredible creative and associative job of seeing the connections of this issue to every other issue that matters to American city dwellers and to global city dwellers, and had really creative solutions to the problem and thought about it so expansively. And, you know, his work just really inspired me, even as someone who thinks about more than just parking. He was thinking about more than just parking, and he was seeing those connections that I think we all need to see. So yeah, R.I.P. Donald Shoup. I think he will be remembered for a very long time.
For a very, very long time. Author of the eponymous High Cost of Free Parking, which is the book you were talking about. I feel like that is just like a required reading for folks who are in planning school these days, and in cities in general. If you're an administrator of some sort, you should read that book, because it kind of lays bare, you know, where we got to, where we are now, and how we can kind of get ourselves out of it. I will say I never did get to talk to Donald Shoup, unfortunately, but we did have an episode with Patrick Siegman, and the title of that episode was The First Shoupista. And it was he's one of Donald's original disciples and doing work at Stanford. And that was one of our most popular episodes, even though Donald wasn't a part of it. Just the inference of Donald Shoup made it so that Patrick, you know, laid out what he did and the importance of it, but people were just really into what Donald was talking about.
Yeah, he was an amazing person, an amazing writer. I recommend reading High Cost of Free Parking as well. And if you're in for a 23-hour audiobook, I just started that as well to try it in that format. And I'm enjoying it that way too.
Thanks to everybody who's ordered Bus and Bike scarves. If you'd like to order one, just head on over to theoverheadwire.com or email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. And we're going to be ordering, actually, we did order the bike-only knit scarves that sold out recently. So I'll have more information about that soon. If you're on the list, I'll contact you and let you know that when they're in. And then if you want to put your name on the list, send me an email, theoverheadwire@gmail.com, and we'll get you on the list, and I'll send you a note when they get in. The green bike-only knit scarves are super popular these days. And as always, we note that we really thank everybody for supporting the show on Patreon, patreon.com/theoverheadwire, or buying books off the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or you can get some of the Cars Are Cholesterol merch through TeePublic, bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol. And we also strongly suggest folks sign up for the newsletter. Before we get to the show, I want to let folks know also that they can get this podcast or Talking Headways wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast Podcasts, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Thanks to everybody who subscribes to the podcatchers. We really appreciate it. And if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review on iTunes. Okay, well, let's get back to the news.
Let's do it.
Okay. This is this is episode 165. We are live and in session. The news, usually we go through kind of some of the top stories that pique our interest from the newsletter every week, every couple weeks. And this week, since Kia's here, I wanted to do things a little bit differently since all the madness is happening with the new administration and it's been hitting transportation, including some new memos that came out that have actually been making people like myself scratch their heads. I wanted to dive into some of that news instead of kind of what was the most popular at the Overhead Wire Daily. We'll get to the right turn on red study and Denver's crazy bike experiment and microplastics and all the stuff that we covered on the newsletter. But there's a lot going on right now in DC. And so, and also I'm not going to speak for you, Kia, but I also personally believe that a lot of what's happening in DC, there's all kinds of stuff that's outside of the transportation space that impacts us. But I want to stick to the topics that we kind of feature and understand because there's so much going on and so much stuff that I disagree with personally. But, we can go deep into the weeds on all of the things that are happening in DC, but I do want to stick to the transportation. So I want to mention that kind of up at the top because I know that there, are cries for revolution and things like that I'm listening to, but we want to stick to what we know and where we have expertise. So that's kind of where I want to start off. So these memos, I wrote down like some notes about basically the memos themselves and parts of like how I feel about them. And then I also looked up some responses to them. But the first memo, I kind of wanted to go through the three memos that got rescinded from previous administrations. And so the first one is that it says to get rid of the DOT Equity Council. And this was to provide independent advice and recommendations about issues of civil rights in various contexts of transportation equity from a variety of leaders. The page that explains more about this was deleted. But I did find the memo itself in the Googles, which seems to figure out where the PDFs are. I hope nobody there in DC that's trying to delete everything is looking through all the Googles because all the PDFs are still up there. You can search for them if you look hard enough. The second thing was it gets rid of a climate change adaptation and resilience policy for DOT operational assets. The department will implement a comprehensive strategy in the following areas. Is what the memo says: characterize risks from climate change, identify and prioritize strategies to address climate change resilience, plan, budget for and implement strategies, review and update climate adaptation and resilience plans, and promote climate literacy. This page has also been deleted. I did find the PDF that explains to that. And then finally, USDOT actions to address environmental justice and minority populations and low-income populations. That's another one that they rescinded. So, I don't know where to start off with these three, really, but I wonder if I could just kind of give you the conch shell and maybe you have some thoughts and feelings about what they took back.
Yeah, Lord of the Flies is the right literary metaphor to be using today. I honestly would have started with two other memos because there's just been so many memos. My life is memos these days that sort of foregrounded the ones that you talked about, the specific rescissions, which were the two big ones that they both were sort of nestled within were what the administration itself is calling the, quote, woke rescission memo. And the other one is lowering costs through smarter policies, not political ideologies. And those memos themselves are incepted from other memos, from other executive orders that Trump put out related to kind of two broad buckets of stuff he wants to do. One is rolling back the Biden era's DEIA policies. The A stands for accessibility. They added that on because they wanted to make extra sure that we know that we are not giving special treatment to folks with disabilities. And then also related to basically deleting any mention of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions from federal policies. That's kind of the overarching umbrellas that we're looking over. And within all of these memos, this universe of memos that we exist within are all kinds of like crazy things, frankly, just to be very blunt about it. Every single, I could write a year's worth of articles about any of these memos because they have line items like, for instance, the DOT is being directed to grant more money to states with higher fertility rates and marriage rates, which is, we can talk about why that's.
We'll get to that.
Idea
I have notes. I have thoughts.
On any level. You talk about using transportation as a way to advance other policy goals, things like denying DOT's funds that, have sanctuary cities and don't cooperate fully with the Trump administration's migration plans and things like that. And the list goes on and on. It's very much a part of a deliberate strategy that this administration has been naked about wanting to put forward to flood the zone, to use the media's either tendency or responsibility, depending on how you look at it, to jump at every little outrage and write a 10-part series about every little line in every memo to make it so that the American people tune out. So they say, well, every time I open the news, it's a new heart attack. I can't have 30 heart attacks a day, so I'm just not going to pay attention to any of this, and I'm not going to engage politically. They're moving fast and breaking things, to put it in like the parlance of the tech sector that has had also a very big influence on this administration, as we all know. So it's a really weird time for transportation. I will not claim to be an expert on all of these things because they have tried really hard to make sure that journalists can't get their arms around all of this, to make sure that none of us can get our arms around all of this. And a lot of this isn't legal and will be thrown out in the courts. And then the big question is whether they will, obey by what the courts tell them to do. There's today, just this afternoon, breaking news that a federal court out of Minnesota has found that they have not obeyed a stay that called on them to continue to pay out the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and things like that, even though it was widely reported that stay had been issued and we're all going to be fine. It doesn't mean that they're actually listening to what the judges say. So we've got layers and layers of mess to sort through.
And that's the thing is, like, there's so much stuff coming at us, we can't keep track of it. You can't even list it out. I mean, I think Tea for America did a fairly good job of like trying to put together in transportation terms what's happening, but there's just like so much stuff that you can't keep up with it. But also a lot of it can seem mundane, but it's actually very subversive. There's a lot of stuff that's in there that's like, oh, well, the birth thing is the birth, rates and marriage rates and all that stuff. That's one thing that kind of steps out of people. And so everybody starts yelling about it, but there's other things in there that's just like, well, what are you doing this for? Like, I mean, it sounds mundane, but like it seems very under the radar in terms of like what you're actually trying to do. And it feels like some of these memos are very like, because they know that they'll get sued and the legal aspect of this will come into play at some point. Although, like you said, JD Vance yesterday said, maybe we don't have to listen to the courts, which is a constitutional crisis, of course. There's a lot of stuff in here that is just under the surface. We know from being in transportation that they might mean this when on the surface they are like, oh, look, everything's hunky-dory and happy, and we're going to focus on connecting people with places where they want to go, the healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. But underneath the surface, there's like one line in there that's like, oh, well, let's make this funding mechanism done by birth rates. Let's make it done by marriage rates, which makes no sense unless you're thinking about trying to figure out how to fund Republican states. I do want to go to those three memos that we talked about a little bit earlier, and the ones that got rescinded, because I think there's some important things in here specifically, and the Equity Council getting rid of climate change adaptation as well as the environmental justice policy. The first thing, like the order itself, and I want to say, because they're rescinding this, because this is important to me anyways, in the way that I think of things, but they're rescinding this order that actually allows the DOT to plan for climate change in a way that will protect assets in the future from being destroyed by climate change. And so we talked to Rob Moore a number of years ago, one of my favorite episodes we did on water. And one of the things he mentioned and talked about was there's a lot of like power stations, there's a lot of like infrastructure that are in flood zones that will get inundated by water if there is a large mass flood event. And so this memo allows for DOT to plan for that in the future and to protect our assets from future inundations and things like that and other climate catastrophes, right? Just because it says climate change, it gets rescinded and it leaves us like worse off. The second thing that I want to mention too is the environmental justice issue. And, I know that you mentioned the memo, like getting rid of woke ideology and all that stuff, but environmental justice just means that we're protecting people from the government. We're actually protecting people from itself. And so this is ridiculous in the way that, like, originally the environmental justice movement, coined by Dr. Robert Bullard at, Texas Southern, the whole idea and the thing that he found was that minority communities in Houston were getting the brunt of the trash disposal in the city. They would get new landfills in their neighborhoods because they were in black and brown communities. And so we're protecting people from the government, from our own worst excesses, and they're rescinding this as well just because it has something to do with environmentalism and they don't like environmentalism.
And it has something to do with equity, and they want equality, not equity, which it is really remains to be seen what they mean by that. And how it can be applied is, as you point out, pretty limitless. And ultimately, I think that's the point, is it gives this administration the tools to do kind of whatever they want under the name of equality rather than equity, which is really, really upsetting.
Which is, yeah, definitely upsetting. So that's that. Do you have any thoughts on those three specific ones before we get to the ensuring reliance upon sound and economic analysis in Department of Transportation policies, programs, and activities? Also, the wordiness of this is really ridiculous.
It's hard. It makes it hard to report on. It makes it hard to make stories that catch people's attention. And it makes it hard to write stories that are actionable. I mean, for me, I've been focused mostly on the DEI stuff, especially just in the last few days, because I'm trying to pick targets for reporting that are actionable in some way, that I can make a really clear case in a reasonable amount of time for why this matters, and give people something to do about it and some tool that they have to not feel hopeless, because I don't want to feel hopeless every day, and I don't want folks in these movements to feel hopeless. So I wrote a story that published today about the impact of specifically the environmental justice orders on sustainable transportation researchers, which is a huge swath of what you and I both are engaging with all day. I get a lot of Streetsblog coverage comes directly out of that research category of the overhead wire. It's not a mystery or a secret at all. And a lot of these grants are coming out of specifically government agencies like the National Science Foundation, which then branch down into all these programs that are funded often by formula through the federal government directly to states. And the National Science Foundation has been directed to go through with a list of keywords that includes words like women or black or equity or barrier, like the most broad keywords that how do they have anything left, and find anything that might violate the DEI order and flag it. And that has resulted in, so far, in the deletion of millions of dollars of projects that we know of, maybe a lot more than millions of dollars. But a lot of folks are really afraid to speak out. They're a little bit nervous that if they haven't had their grant canceled yet, they will, because again, these are terms that are being used in such a way that they could target any community that you could remotely spin as diverse as needing of equity action, of needing of inclusion and accessibility improvements, which, spoiler alert, is all of America, because we're not very good at those things as it starts, And also, spoiler alert, the Biden administration had the Justice 40 initiative and went way above and beyond to make sure that at least 40% of resources were put into DEI in every government program. So it's going to be those things where it's going to allow a lot of, if we don't have checks on power, which we do have some, I hope they will be strong. I am fighting for them to be strong, will allow this administration to kind of cut things as suits them. And what their motivations are hard to say, besides power and enrichment.
I think that's an important point that you made, because a lot of these key terms can mean anything. And, women in a paper can flag 50% of the papers maybe, because they mention, women and children, or transportation policy as it relates to women, or some related thing. I think it's just a checkpoint for them to figure out what they don't like and what they do like. And they're using these terms as ways to flag all of these research pieces and funding mechanisms. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just basically what do we not like? And that's not very democratic in the sense of the word, in that, the Congress should be the one that's actually figuring out what to, fund and what to not fund, the power of the purse, as it were. And, the Republicans in Congress right now aren't necessarily exercising that from the Senate and Congress. And so I think what we're fearing, or what I'm fearing specifically, is that they're just going to go through and see if they can find stuff they don't like and then kick it out. I've already heard from places, and I don't want to be too specific, but I've already heard from places that are changing their names because of the specific targets that are happening. They're changing their names. They're stopping advertising. They're stopping doing this, that, and the other thing because they're worried about getting a target. And I understand specifically where the fear is coming from, because if they get their funding pulled, they can't do their great work. And so, changing a word here, tweaking a word there is getting to the point where, it's something that they're trying to hide away, and it shouldn't be hidden. All this stuff should be available. You shouldn't be deleting old memos. You shouldn't be deleting old web pages. If you don't like it, then you can change policy, but deleting it, that's another thing entirely. And that feels very, very, anti-democratic on its face.
Anti-democratic, and I don't know. I also just like shooting themselves in the foot unless their only goal is to seize power. I mean, like, if the way that the system is supposed to typically work is you pass a law to change society in the way that you want it to, and you have to follow the paper trail of like past research on why the laws that came before you didn't work, and they're not going to be able to do that. But I digress. It's a little bit of a digression. I wanted to go back to the thing you said about all these organizations changing their names or changing their rhetoric to not trip up those lists of keywords that the administration is putting out, to not be DEIA, but instead something else. One thing that I'm interested in following as I continue my coverage of this, and I'm curious if you or anyone else listening to this has any storylines along this line, is like how we can morph the movement to make, I can't even call it sustainable transportation our default, but to increase transportation freedom and choice, how we can put it in other terminology. Because like the one thing that I've sort of drawn to the surface as I've been thinking about this is a lot of the reasons why ostensibly on its face the Trump administration says that they object to DEI or greenhouse gas mitigation are because they care about other things more. Well, automobility touches those other things more, like in the woke rescission memo, they talk a lot about how we can't mention climate change because the social cost of carbon metric isn't valid and that kind of a thing. But we could mention air pollution and we could mention the health impacts of air pollution. I'm like, well, cool. I've got lots of stats on that. One thing I drew out in the conversation about privileging states with lots of babies, it's like, well, I don't know that I agree that marriage rates and birth rates are a good way to do this unless you're just trying to put up like Wyoming and North Dakota as the top beneficiaries of federal programs. But if you wanted to benefit families, boy, have I got a list of sidewalks that you can fix if you want to do that. Here's where you should start. And how much of this is going to be a challenge of standing up to this power and how much is going to be a challenge of changing our rhetoric to suit this power? And I don't really know. It's going to be an interesting time to do my job and for all of us to do our work.
I think it's hard for people who have kind of learned to speak a certain way to change that really instantly. It's hard to change your discussion about talking about equity and inclusion and diversity into something that isn't. I mean, if you look at this other memo that they sent out, I mean, there are some stuff that seem benign, right? Like thinking about, there's a piece in here about promoting job access and access to healthcare, and there's a line in there that's pretty benign if on the surface, but it's basically they're just trying to change the language that you use to talk about some of the similar things that we've been talking about, and so that's kind of frustrating in that, like, why are we changing the language to something that we all agree on something specific? It means something specific, accessibility, for example. Right. And so I think that's frustrating too. You mentioned the social cost of carbon. That the memo tries to reduce the impact of that. Obviously, we know that there is a social cost of carbon because we have climate change, and then it impacts a lot of the things that we're doing. I also, I'm talking to you right now, I feel flustered from, like, I have all these thoughts and ideas, and then it's hard to get them out because I feel like overwhelmed. And I think that's part of the MO as well, because there are very specific things that are targetable, but there's like all this other stuff happening and it's floating around my brain and I can't quite focus. And I think that's part of what they're trying to do as well. Let's talk about this. I know you've got a little bit of time here. So I want to talk about the birth rate thing. I'm trying to look for this in my notes because I had so many. because there's so much stuff that
Welcome
happens.
to my world, Jeff.
I know.
My Word document is a mess. I've got like a running reporting document where I take notes on where I'm going to kind of go in the next week or two. And I'm like,
it's
no,
it's
this
your
is
brain.
the manifesto now.
It's your brain. Asserts that DOT-supported programs and activities, including grants and loans, shall not be used to further local political objectives or projects that are purely... Oh, this is a whole other thing.
I know, right? It doesn't end. And I will say almost everything we've talked about in the last 20 minutes has been packed into 2 pages. Like, it's insane. Like how, like,
I know.
it's just really crammed in and in coded language that could be interpreted a lot of different ways legally.
There's a function of this memo that says that we want to prioritize places with high marriage rates and high birth rates. And usually what the DOT does is they look for things through formulas, and usually it's done by population. And in this instance, there is kind of a pro-natalist streak at the administration currently that's focused on these issues, and they've tied it into something that usually doesn't get tied to transportation funding, which is birth rates and marriage rates. And if you do that, and if you look at the data like Yona Freemark and Lynn Dewey Rennett have done, like Henry Grabar has done, looking at who gets funded through this, it becomes obvious about like what they're trying to do, which is fund more red states. But what's not obvious is like how this impacts places that have high, like say immigration rates, places that have high density, places that have, I mean, we know what it does to density, but it doesn't quite make sense from a funding mechanism standpoint. And I'm trying to wrap my head around why you do this aside from all of the ancillary things that they're thinking about. And rewarding the people that they want to reward. But from a transportation standpoint, I mean, I even saw quotes from like conservative activists and conservative, people who are in the transportation industry that are like, I don't know what this is. I don't understand this at all. It doesn't make any sense. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around it specifically because it's just wild.
I don't think there's much to wrap your head around, honestly. I think you're
am I trying too hard?
Where you're a smart guy and you're trying to make sense of something that fundamentally doesn't make a lot of sense. My read on it, frankly, is that this is an administration that is using all departments of government in various ways as a cudgel to advance unrelated agendas. I think that like the pro-natalist argument of, more babies equals more transportation dollars. And by the way, not like the number of children in the state, by the by, it's fertility rates, which is a separate metric, and isn't, it's going to be specifically like native born children. Like it is like stemming from things like the quiverful movement. I suspect it's stemming from these pro-natalist ideas that America is going to be challenged as a country if we don't have our domestic baby supply get up, which makes no sense unless that's what you want, unless you are less interested in actual living children, many of whom are going to be, children of immigrants, products of even domestic migration. And I mean, I will also just add one thing. The fertility rates clearly benefits red states. The marriage rates does not clearly benefit red states. There are actually a lot of, and especially when you start looking at like slicing it at the city scale and the MSA scale, there are certain like urban areas that have much higher fertility and marriage rates than a lot of rural areas and a lot of red areas. And so this might backfire them in certain ways. I would say that particular policy is working very well to draw a lot of attention away from other policies buried in these memos that are sneaking in through the back door. And it's hard for me to know which ones they're most serious about and which ones they will let go as bargaining chips and which ones they'll just kind of let float free because they've got a couple of very influential people within this administration who have some pretty cockamamie ideas about the role of fertility rates and the success of a society. Like not to be totally cynical, but that's really my read on it.
I mean, you wrote a great piece talking about like what you could do if you actually did care about children and families. And I think that that's really important to bring out too, is like, if we really did care about children and families, we'd do a lot of different things. And from a transportation standpoint, you like you said, sidewalks. I mean, making sure people are safe on their way to school, making sure, the free range kids can go wherever they want without getting yelled at and harassed. There's a whole lot of stuff that we could do. And as the father of a 2.5-year-old, like, I worry about like walking down the street and whether a car is going too fast and speed limits and those types of things, and whether she's going to get hit by a 2-ton vehicle. I hate having to have this conversation with her every time we cross the street. That car is big. That car will hurt. And that is like, devastating every time I have to have that conversation, because she wants to be free and run around and play. And I want her to, but at the same time, like, it's a dangerous place for kids out on the streets. And so if we really cared about that, we'd care about safety. We'd care about healthcare. We'd care about childcare. We'd care about all these things in the care economy that we tried to focus on previously. But fertility rates and birth rates, that's just going at the start of it, not the lives that they live afterwards. And so you're right. It goes back towards some of these other movements that are kind of infiltrating those ideas. Dug into underneath this, like you said, some hidden stuff. They actually have at the end of the memo, it says, asserts that DOT supported programs and activities, including grants and loans, should not be used to further local political objectives and projects that are purely local in nature and unrelated to a proper federal interest, i.e. transit, bike lanes, walking.
Yeah.
It doesn't say transit, bike lanes, walking, but we know from following this from long enough that federal interest means highways and roads, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the subversive part that's dug into this. Oh, it has to be purely, it can't be politically local in nature. That means we're going to fund roads.
Absolutely. And it also is like digging into the DNA of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which had historic amounts of like direct funding between the federal government and local governments, like way more so than the previous like surface transportation reauthorization. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's a elaborate dog whistle for more highway funding and more funding for big roads that connect areas. It would be really interesting to see someone try to make the argument for like, great, let's do a lot of Amtrak, let's do a lot of intercity buses, let's open up the funding stream for that. But like that would be much more naked if that were the intention. So yeah, I mean, I will say the feelings that we are both feeling right now, because I can hear you're like, in your voice that I'm feeling all the time, is how they want us to feel. They want us to feel overwhelmed. And maybe the answer is like, when I feel this way, I'm trying to make it a practice to like take a breath, to take a step back, and to find something that I do feel like I have influence over, where I'm not just arguing with someone who doesn't speak my language about something that impacts my life and my ability to thrive and live, and the lives and ability to thrive and live of everyone that I care about, including folks I don't even know. So, I mean, I anticipate myself writing a lot about federal transportation funding in the next year. I also anticipate myself writing a lot about local fights, because that's where we're going to feel empowered for a little while, I think. At least while the judiciary hopefully keeps some of this stuff at bay, because a lot of this stuff, again, is not legal, is not there. They cannot do it according to the law. The question is whether the judiciary will prevent them from doing it. And until that happens, there's not as much we can do besides the infinity things that we can do at our local neighborhood scales, at our state scale in some cases, not so much in mine. I'm in Missouri. It's a little bit tough here. But yeah, I just want to caution everyone, even as I am telling you things and writing things that are stressing you out, please don't let that be the only emotion you feel about transportation, because there is so much hope. You just have to find it, and you have to make it a practice to claim it.
Yeah. I published a piece about this morning. It wasn't me publishing. I share news from other places and other great writers that are doing great work. But we published a piece from Sweden that was talking about the changes in urban design that they did in this small town in the northern part of the country, and how they made everybody feel safe. And 99% of the people feel safe in that town, which is way higher than places that you would think are very safe, like Zurich and Bern and Switzerland, which only get like 65 to 75% rates. But this place has redesigned their roads, their lighting, their parking garages, everything to feel safe. And so there is good news out there. There is stuff that's happening that's positive, and it is local to a certain extent. And so to the extent that we can, make sure that we're doing things on the local level that are actually impacting people directly. Local, all politics is local to a certain extent. I believe I've heard that several times.
But I think it's important to make the distinction between the way you're saying all politics is local and the way they're saying all transportation policy at the federal level should not be local.
Yes.
It's a
distinction.
And it's a distinction that matters. And I think that it is possible to both engage deeply in your local community when you are feeling overwhelmed in particular, and without abandoning this federal fight, because it does matter. It will shape our communities. They're going to build that highway through your neighborhood, whether you like it or not, probably. So yeah, we will have to oscillate for a long time, just like we were before, frankly, between fighting structural forces at the federal level that are really scary and really big and feel really unstoppable, and cultivating positive forces at the local level. It's just the stakes and the urgency have gotten a lot higher.
Yeah. Well, so there's so much more we could talk about. I don't want to take too much more of your time. There's all kinds of stuff in here about ICE enforcement and vaccine mandates and crazy stuff like that. But I do want to say there are great resources for folks who are interested in learning more about what's going on, about funding freezes for their local funding for their local project and things like that. T4 has put together some really good timelines. I know, Kia, you're working on some really awesome stuff at Streetsblog USA. And so I want to promote those avenues for learning more about like what you can do, what's happening, keeping it to, don't stress too much. I mean, I know I've been spending way too much time on Blue Sky, like doom scrolling, and my wife's wondering like, are you okay? And so I think I need to, kind of center myself on, what can be done and also the good stuff that's happening as well. I also want to note that, there is good in calling your representatives and your senators and your congresspeople. And I called Nancy Pelosi recently and left my message, and they actually acknowledged that I did that, and I appreciated that. So she's my representative. I do what you can in that realm. And as Carter Lavin always tells me, make sure there's an actionable item to all the stuff that you talk about. So we want to make sure that we're doing that too. So this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Hateways really wouldn't be here without you. So thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic over the last 5 years. Oh my gosh, 5 years. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a $10 and a handwritten note and a sweet railway station stamp. And $10 a month will get you one of our bus-only scarves in addition to the stickers and a handwritten note. We also, again, we have the bike-only scarves too. So if you want one of those, let us know if you sign up for the $10 a month Patreon. We really appreciate folks that did that. Also, I want to mention we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. So listener questions and comments. We didn't have any listeners and questions and comments this week, but if you have any comments or questions, and if you want them read out on the air, let me know. If you don't, let me know that as well. theoverheadwire@gmail.com. We get lots of both, so appreciate that. Kia, before we go, we usually do a segment called Puppies and Butterflies, and I do it a little bit later, but something happy or fun that's outside of the realm of transportation possibly. Is there any Puppies and Butterflies that you might have for this week?
Boy, well, I just watched my last Oscar-nominated Best Picture nominee yesterday.
Oh, nice.
It wasn't a Puppies and Butterflies film, but like the space of the movie theater, the third space of the movie theater is a Puppies and Butterflies place for me. It's where I can sort of like both get that healthy mix of detaching from like the slow drip of poison that is the newsfeed, and also like rooting and attaching deeply with like someone's art. And I saw I'm Still Here, which was also nominated for Best International Feature. It's about political disappearances. I'm realizing this is a bad fit for this segment in real time. But just the fact that there are so many amazing films being released and also recognized and also not recognized, to be clear, right now is something that brings me a lot of joy, that like human beings keep making awesome art all the time. And, that's the other side of my interests that I like to take some time to shout out when I can. Awesome.
Well, Kia, where can folks find you?
You can find me at usa.streetsblog.org. I write most of the articles you will see there because I'm the only full-time staffer that is just working on USA. We also have some dual staffers who do some stuff for most of their stuff, I should say, for New York City. You can find me on Blue Sky at Kia Wilson, Kia KEA, like the Swedish furniture store, not the Korean car is what I like to say. Wilson at Blue Sky, however you stylize that. I can't remember their nomenclature now. I guess I'm still on X, but I don't really post there anymore for reasons that might be obvious, except for when I really gotta. But the NTSB is only posting there, so I have to stay on there for now. So lots of fun stuff there. But yeah, or you can email me, KEA@streetsblog.org.
Awesome. And you can also listen to Kia's podcast, The Break, at Streetsblog as well. You should do that. Get that in your feed.
We have a new episode coming out tomorrow with Karina Ricks from CityFi and Benji De La Pena from Shared Use Mobility Center. They won and then immediately were paused on a grant to study light electric vehicles at the neighborhood scale and like model policies to make them like normal all over the United States. It's going to be a really cool conversation. You should tune in.
Awesome.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, Kia, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks for joining us on Mondays at the Over the Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. And we'll see you next time.
Talking